Thank you, everyone. So I am so excited to welcome everyone to the Society for the Advancement of Socioeconomics Women and Gender Forum event called Politics and the Sociology of Finance, New Books on the Block. And I'm Megan Tobias Neely. And I would like to first start by welcoming and introducing our panelists today and their outstanding new books on the sociology of finance. So it's my pleasure to introduce Basak Kus, who's Associate Professor of Government at Wesleyan University. She is the author of Disembedded: Regulation, Crisis, and Democracy in the Age of Finance, which was released today officially on the website by the Oxford University Press. And congratulations. The book examines the evolution of the state-finance relationship from the early 1970s onward in the United States, highlighting critical policy decisions and market outcomes that culminated in the financial crisis and current populist movements. So congratulations again. And Kim Pernell is Assistant Professor in the Department of Sociology and the Human Dimensions of Organizations program at the University of Texas at Austin. Her books, Visions of Financial Order, National Institutions, and the Development of Banking Regulation, is forthcoming with Princeton University Press in August of 2024. So we're looking forward to that book. And in the book, she uses comparative historical methods to study the cases of the US, Canada, and Spain to examine how differences in national financial regulatory systems emerge from divergent beliefs about economic order and prosperity. So a big congrats to you, Kim, and to you both. We're so excited to have these books out. And before I dive into the questions, I just want to encourage everyone in the audience to, post any questions you have in the Q&A or in the chat, and we'll return to them in the Q&A. So we'll make time for all of them. And I wanted to first start by the event by asking a little bit about what the books are about and really what motivated each of you to write these timely books. So Basak, why don't you start us off today?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for the lovely introduction, Megan. And also, you didn't say, but we will get to talk a little bit about your award-winning book as well. But thank you so much for agreeing to moderate this discussion. So my book, I like to think about it in 4 or 5 different ways. One is a sociology of the American state. It looks at the remaking of the American regulatory state in the 4 decades leading up to the financial crisis. The story begins in the 1970s and tries to trace how American government's government's approach to risk regulation has changed over time. And when I say American government's approach to risk regulation, I think about the risk regulating state as a protective state, to borrow the term from Chris Ansel. Of course, this time was also at the time of major structural change in the economy. The economy was undergoing financialization. So the way the state understood and tackled risk regulation had major implications for American financialization. And so that's the second aspect of the book. I like to think of it as a sort of a story about the regulatory environment of American financialization, what ideas and policies constituted that regulatory environment, whose ideas, and so on and so forth. A third way I like to think about it is as a story that provides a historical perspective on the financial crisis. That's what eventually in chapter 6, I arrive at the financial crisis and government's response to it. And finally, questions of regulation in my mind, especially financial regulation, although they're often seen as sort of, and I'm sure Kim would relate to it as well, as somewhat obscure and esoteric issues. They are not. The way the state understood and approached regulating finance has had massive consequences for the level of systemic risk the economy embodied, for what was happening to consumers, for what, how people were dealing with their socioeconomic circumstances on a daily basis. So they were actually very consequential and much more closer to home in ways that we, in ways that we often don't think about. And because what the state did had, led to certain structural risk deficits, they have direct consequences for democratic stability. So in my mind, this is all about regulatory policy, risk deficit, economic crisis, but eventually about democratic crisis. And that's a very Polanyian way of framing things. And that's how I ultimately like to think about the book, bringing Polanyi to the time of neoliberalism and financialization, because Polanyi wrote about liberalism and industrialization. And I wanted to call it Polanyi on Wall Street initially, but after some discussions, the title changed. The books could have nicknames. And just I'll take a minute in terms of what motivated to write it. As someone who obtained her PhD in 2008, not exactly a great time when you could think that you could build a prosperous future for yourself. I wanted to have a better understanding of how we got there, and the books that had come out early on were most written by economists. I felt like they lacked a theory of the state. They did not explicitly think of it as, in relation to questions of democracy, and they took certain things for granted, I felt. So they would explain, oh, so-and-so policy would led to so-and-so outcome. But I wanted to understand how that so-and-so regulation came into place in the first place. What was the governance logic behind it? Whose logic was it? And so on and so forth. And I felt very fortunate to work on this book because I think for some time, for my generation, surely, for those of us who lived through the roaring 90s, and our kids are, who are my students now, I think the way we studied the state economy relationship had taken a somewhat technocratic turn and moved away from the larger critical questions of capitalism in relation to state, democracy, crisis, justice. So I felt like the post-crisis context opened up that sort of space, and that's how I wanted to come to it. Sorry, did I take too long? I'm so sorry if I did.
No.
You're great. Kim, why don't we hand it over to you?
Thank you. No, not too long at all. I was like gripped by listening to what you were saying here. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So like Basak, my book is also about banking regulation, but from a different and complementary angle. So I'm interested in how policymakers across different countries came to develop such different systems of banking regulation leading up to the 2008 global financial crisis. And these differences in regulatory systems mattered because they had real implications for how banks in each of these countries experienced the crisis. So as noted in the introduction, I focus on comparing the cases of the development of financial regulation in the US, Canada, and Spain. And the punchline of the book is that the systems of financial regulation that defined this era were deeply influenced by different principles of order that are embedded in national regulatory and political institutions. Or to put the same point in a different way, I find that regulators in different countries subscribe to different understandings about the causes of prosperity and stability in the economy, which also suggested different ideas about how to effectively regulate the financial system to promote order. So in other words, if we want to understand the origins of better or worse systems of financial regulation, it's not enough to consider the economic trends that are placing new pressures on regulators around the world. It's not even enough to just examine the rising power and influence of the regulated financial system. What regulators believe and how they see the world also matters for the kinds of policy solutions they adopt. And I suggest that these beliefs among national regulators have deep institutional roots. So in terms of motivation, the puzzle that led me to start this project did not end up being the puzzle that the book ended up being oriented around. So where I started with this project was with this question of, at a time when financial regulation is becoming increasingly transnational, increasingly global, increasingly decided at the international level, why in 2008 did we have a bunch of countries with like very different regulatory systems with very different implications for bank outcomes? And so I thought that was an interesting question, but then when I started figuring out the answer wasn't all that surprising. It's like, okay, banking, international financial regulations, like lots of forms of transnational regulation, are intentionally designed to be broad and flexible. And this left a lot of room for, discretion for local regulators to continue, making different choices in different areas. So I realized that the interesting puzzle was, well, why did these regulatory systems take the distinctive forms that they did in different national environments? And then even building on this, like, why did comparative patterns in financial regulation in the 2 decades leading up to the crisis look so different from the comparative patterns across these same countries only 2 decades before this. So like, let me give you a sense of what I mean. So 1990s and 2000s, leading up to the global financial crisis, the comparative regulatory trends I saw across these 3 countries, US, Canada, and Spain, looked a lot like what I would expect as a scholar of institutions and economic policy making. So we've got the US, you know, the paradigmatic neoliberal economy with its hands-off laissez-faire regulation that like led to negative consequences for banks. We have Canada, which is, you know, still a very much a liberal market economy, but maybe on the more conservative side compared to the US. And they have a very liberal system of financial regulation that still included a few key safeguards that the US lacked. Then we've got Spain with a more established institutional history of, you know, allowing the state to play some role in managing the economy, adopting a regulatory system that was comparatively strict and interventionist, especially compared to the US and Canada. But when I go back only 2 decades, so shifting back to the 60s and 70s, I find almost the complete opposite pattern. So here we've got Canada leading the way in terms of being the hands-off, you know, laissez-faire regulatory system. We even have Spain experimenting with a lot of different regulatory models, but well on the path towards financial liberalization and financial deregulation by the early 1970s. And then we've got the US as the holdout. So the US enters the 1960s with one of the world's strictest regulatory systems in place, and, you know, featuring, you know, restrictions on bank structures and activities that weren't found in many other countries. And then beyond that, it's unusually slow to eliminate some of the regulatory restrictions like that they had, right? So on pretty much every aspect of financial deregulation that has interested scholars in the US was one of the last countries in comparative perspective to finally take this step towards financial deregulation. So basically, my book is motivated by the desire to explain this pattern, right? So, which became a lot more nuanced once I looked at things both comparatively and historically. Why is it that the content of financial regulatory systems has both remained so persistently different across countries, yet has also changed dramatically, like within countries over time? So, thanks, Megan.
Thank you both. And one thing I think, you know, is so great about both books is that this motivation that was kind of sparked by the problems and puzzles posed by the 2008 financial crisis, but then both books, you know, take such a meticulous and historical look at the antecedents to it that really helps to understand it better and in such complementary but different ways. So I wanted to hear next about what are a couple of the kind of main takeaways from the books that you want this audience to you know, leave the session with. And Kim, we'll start with you this time.
All right, if y'all haven't heard enough from me after that last introduction, okay, I'm happy to give you my 3 takeaways. All right, takeaway number 1 is a simple but I think under-recognized one, and Basak, I think we share this, which is that national banking regulators and their choices still really matter for things that we care about in the economy, even in a world where more and more regulatory choices are being decided at the international level. Takeaway 2 is that what banking regulators believe shapes the policy choices that they make in important and, I argue, under-recognized ways. And more than that, what regulators believe is shaped by more than just their professional identity or their professional training. Regulators, like the rest of us, are also members of national societies, and the principles of order embedded in these national political and regulatory institutions also inform the way that they view the world. And then finally, my 3rd takeaway is that national institutions are multifaceted and heterogeneous. That is, national institutions consist of multiple narrower principles of order. And so I'm hardly the first scholar in sociology to recognize that feature of institutions. But I do think that when we look back at sociological research that's looking at how institutions shape economic policy, when we talk about like the different, strands, the cultural elements that make up institutions, we think of them as like hanging together within countries and elective affinities in ways that reproduce stable policy patterns within countries over long stretches of time. And that's important. But I think what I'm bringing to the picture here is that I also emphasize how these same principles of order within countries can come into conflict, can and often do come into conflict. And so looking at 200 years of conflict over banking regulation across 3 countries, what I see is that policymakers within countries are constantly fighting over the same basic themes. So in these debates, like sometimes one principle dominates, sometimes another principle dominates. Looking at the specifics of this is really important for understanding how regulation has evolved within countries over time. But my point here is like, even as the countries shift back and forth between very different regulatory models, the arc of this pendulum is constrained by like deeper institutional principles that have been present in each country for a very long time.
Mhm.
All right, Basak, yeah.
Yeah, no, I would completely agree with Kim about the, importance of the nation level, so much so that one shortcoming of my book is I really don't address international level. It's a very much a sort of a historical story based on the American case. I also agree with Kim about how things are not necessarily linear, and there are all these twists and turns in history, which is so much fun to unpack. And then I also love that you mentioned again, US being actually sort of a case of heavier regulation compared to, this is something that Monica Prasad had written about as well, and sort of how it motivated, right? When we got to the Clinton era, calls for more deregulation in the financial sector. Now, what I would love for you to walk away, my takeaways. To go from my book, I mean, one big argument that I would like to push back against it. This is something that I've been sitting uncomfortably with since, since the immediate aftermath of the crisis, is that the prevalent view seems to suggest that the crisis occurred because the US government, guided by neoliberal ideas, pursued deregulatory policies and create an environment in which financial institutions were able to run amok and take excessive risks until they inevitably crashed and burned. This is not wrong when you take a bird's eye view, neoliberalism, deregulation, crisis, but it's incomplete in some ways and misleading in others. So first of all, I've grown very wary of analysis that chalk it up to neoliberalism loosely. I felt like we need to specify the ideas that precisely shaped the state's regulatory relationship with the economy during the last quarter of the 20th century as financialization was underway. And how these ideas gained political traction under successive administrations, and we should do this rather than constantly invoking Hayek and Friedman. Queen Slobodian says, there were intellectual agents who got their hands dirty, advising businesses, pressuring governments, drawing up charts, and gathering statistics. So I really wanted to understand who those agents were that were talking about regulation. And, they took me back to 1970s regulatory sort of regulatory theories coming from economists. And even within that, there are so many different camps, right? There you have the regulatory captured people associated with Stigler, you have the rent-seeking people, you have people like Bill Niskanen, and then you have new public management theories coming out of business schools. And then in the 1990s, you have financial economists. And their ideas mattered. And these people, as also the book Economists Are clearly puts it, until 1970s. And so you have all these lawyers sitting in American regulatory agencies, but after that, economists start taking over. And these guys and their students are the ones, and they had very specific ideas about what kind of regulation and how to regulate. That mattered. So that's one thing that I wanted to understand. The second takeaway is, I think we need a more comprehensive view of the policy tools that these ideas inspired. I think the narrow focus on deregulation resulted in overlooking some very critical institutional and policy transformations that fundamentally reshaped the government's relationship to economy and financialization. it is not to say that I'm not belonging to the school that deregulation is exaggerated, because there's that school. No, very important deregulatory changes had happened. They had happened by the end of the 1980s, right? We have like 1980, 1982, 1984. We have these successive deregulatory moves that really completely changed the way financial markets worked and who the actors and what the products were. At the same time, that's only a part of the picture. Scholars like Paul Pearson and Jacob Hecker has been saying that, oh, it's not deregulation, but regulatory drift, how markets has been changing, but policies and statutes have been slow or frozen to respond to them. That's what we should look at. And that's one thing that I look at in the book. But in my mind, there are two other major policy shifts that took place that are so crucial. And one is a shift towards micro-orientation in risk regulation on the part of the American governments. And this took the form of both focusing on micro-prudential regulation, but also principles-based regulation. I think that was so important. And a fourth dimension was what I call the rise of information-based regulation, rather than substantive regulation, meaning you can do this, you cannot do this. Why don't you disclose what you're doing, right? And the parties to the exchange decide. So the rise of disclosures, the rise of rating agencies, and the rise of the emphasis being put on consumer literacy, financial literacy, were all related parts of this information-based regulatory shift. And that's how I want to study the regulatory environment's change. And also have a problem with the narrative of finance running amok, because, and this is something actually I quote Kim in my book, from her dissertation, not the book, but many practices that were later seen as running amok were at the time seen as completely reasonable and prudential practices by the people undertaking them and by the regulators letting them. But more so, the running amok narrative, I think, spotlights the activities of individual firms and essentially characterizes risk-taking as something firms do or refrain from doing, both obscuring and concealing the systemic nature of risk. So I think what we should focus on is deficit in risk regulation as a structural feature of American political economy. Again, this is my Polanyian sense kicking in here. And then the last thing that I would like you to walk away is that, as I said before, questions of regulation are inherently about questions of democracy, and we should understand them as such. So I'm very motivated in bringing regulatory politics to making it what you might say a more hot area of political economy. So those are my takeaways.
Which are such important takeaways with the current events going on today. And I think, one thing I wanted to return to that you both have shared a bit in what you've said so far, but is this way that both of your books kind of overlap on the themes around and concern public perceptions of issues like uncertainty, risk, and order with respect to financial markets. And so I wondered if you each could kind of maybe discuss together, how does your research extend or exchange or change understandings of financial instability and crisis?
Mm-hmm. Kim, would you like to take it?
Sure. I think one of the things I most enjoyed in reading Basak's book is how I think we have a pretty similar take on this. So I will give what I think our take is, and I would love to hear if you agree and maybe add on, right? But I think in terms of, public perceptions of uncertainty, risk, and order, I think a big takeaway from both of our work here is that crises and economic events are matters of interpretation. And for me, this came through to me most clearly in comparative perspective, where I was surprised in looking at episodes of financial crises over long stretches of time, how policymakers across different countries faced with very similar raw material of a crisis, right? So basic building blocks of what is happening in the economy often came to very different interpretations, reactions, responses, explanations for the objective economic facts that were unfolding, and in ways that like were roughly predictable if you understood, you know, the orientation that regulators were bringing to banking regulation. So I think the punchline here would be, you know, how would this change understandings of financial crises? And I would say that too often we look backwards in history and think that, you know, the response that was undertaken was a foregone conclusion based on the events that actually unfolded. But in fact, there were multiple pathways that could have been taken that were not. And to explain why the path taken was the path taken either across countries or historically, we need to look again to the way that regulators see the world instead of just dismissing this as epiphenomenal. So.
I completely, I mean, I agree with everything. We should have co-authored, Kim.
I know.
What else could I add to it? I mean, in terms of like, I'll take them separately, risk and the crisis. With the crisis, one thing that I've been saying over and over in the book is that the 2007-2010 financial crisis should not be narrowly viewed in terms of declining growth rates or stock market dips. And at its core, it should be understood as a crisis of disembeddedness in the Polanyian sense. And this is important. Like, this is not something that you can throw money at. This is a very long structural process. And you know, in the aftermath of the crisis, we were talking about re-embedding. But before you can talk about re-embedding, you should understand what was disembedded more properly. And so when evaluating the government's response to the crisis, it's important not to focus on things like simply speed of recovery, but more importantly, whether and how adequately the protective deficiencies underpinning this disembeddedness were addressed. So given the extent of deficiency in systemic risk protection, consumer protection, and socioeconomic risk protection prevailing in America's financialized economy, my take was that the government's response, for the most part, embraced an incrementalistic and technocratic vision. And this is not to say that important steps were not taken after the crisis. They were. Consumer Financial Protection Agency was founded, FSAC was established, capital and liquidity buffers have increased, government put in place an ordered resolution procedure for large companies and tried to bring derivative markets under regulatory oversight, and so on and so forth. Despite all these measures, which were not insignificant by any means, it is still hard to say that a fundamental transformation happened in the structures of risk mitigation, which brings me to the question of temporality of crisis. When that sort of structural reform does not happen, and when we are still facing questions of moral hazard, when we look at patterns of inequality, when we look at patterns of indebtedness, and we don't see major changes, again, if you take the kind of view of crisis that I take, are we really out of it, right? So that's one issue. The other issue was, you know, the sort of post-crisis politics, how, you know, top, bottom up, how these things were, because, you know, there are so many sort of comparisons made with Great Depression and post-Great Depression responses. And I'm really inspired by scholars like Sabi Rahman, who wrote Democracy Against Domination, who is very critical of the lack of sort of that bottom-up civil society involvement in the post-crisis reform processes. And this is one thing that I mean when I say, are we really out of it? Have you really dealt with a non-technocratic sort of kind of structural change that was needed? In terms of risk, during writing this book, I started reading Ulrich Beck a little bit again and sort of went back to those like risk society discussions and how financialization should make us. And, you know, Beck talks a lot about tragic individualization and organized irresponsibility, patterns that I definitely saw in the context of financialization and government's sort of management of it, because, you know, in the 1980s, the increasing size and complexity of financial markets and how individuals and households increased reliance on them, from using credit cards to investing in 401k plans, they were facilitated by global and technological changes that were not within their reach, that had nothing to do with them, but that had changed their lives in such drastic ways. But at the same time, a sort of a personal responsibility crusade had been launched. So in this sense, in my mind, this embedded financialization and its sort of risk structure is one that involves the twin processes of what Ulrich Beck calls organized irresponsibility on the one hand and tragic individualization on the other hand. On the one hand, the increasing complex nature of the financialized economy, I argue, made it particularly difficult to identify who and what may be responsible for creating risk, which in turn actually was a factor in empowering economists as the experts par excellence in sort of informing and managing these processes. But on the other hand, people were thrown back onto themselves as responsible consumers and so on, and rational actors and so on and so forth. They had to fend for themselves. So Beck calls it a process of like disembedding without embedding. And I found it really useful in terms of thinking about risk and uncertainty in their financialization.
Well, and on the related side of this risk piece, both books really focus also on the state finance relationship. So what I wanted to hear a little bit more about how each of your books kind of shape or maybe change our understanding of the state, especially in the American case that you both focus on.
I will answer this, but Megan, after we finish, I feel like you have some points that you might be able to add on this topic. And so I would love, after we respond, if you could summarize the key points of your award-winning book and also give us your take on the state finance relationship, because I feel like you have something to say here as well. So what I feel like my punchline for, especially in the American case, like thinking about the state finance relationship, like what I would want to add to this. Like, I think I would like to emphasize how so much of the focus has been on political battles within the United States over financial regulation. And we think of the political left and the political right as like having very different ideas about how to effectively regulate the economy and, you know, very different policy solutions. And it's not that that's untrue, but I do think that we haven't yet recognized, to the extent that I would like us to recognize, the degree to which these American arguments have been narrowed in a very, they're narrower than the full range of arguments we could be having about financial regulation. So like in litigating, you know, complete deregulation or, you know, too big to fail, right? We miss other important regulatory issues about, for example, the question of whether increasing competitive pressures in and of themselves drive banks of all size categories and degrees of government protection to take on greater risk, and like what that might mean for the structure of, you know, say counter-cyclical regulation, regulation of like liquidity buffers, regulatory standards that apply to financial organizations of many different size categories rather than limiting our focus to the largest and most systemically important financial institutions. So again, the punchline I would say is how the American obsession with either government overreach or the preserving the valuable local orientation, specialization, and fragmentation of the financial system. Even though we think of those things as like being very competing principles, other countries are talking about other issues, and it would be nice to take a page from other scripts to have a more vibrant and hopefully useful conversation about financial regulation. Yeah.
Before I get to my own points, I want to emphasize what Kim said in terms of like this neat, convenient argument that is being made about like, oh, financial deregulations was a right-wing sort of a thing. And I think what you're saying, Kim, is like the boundaries were blurred, and in many cases, democratic legislators were very much in favor of these deregulatory moves that, you know, everybody became critical of later on. So I completely agree with that. Okay, so in my study of the state, I think economists as experts loom large in my story. And as I was doing the finishing details, that Bob Berman's book, Thinking Like an Economist, came out, and I'm so excited about the book. I think it's a great book. I was like, yeah, I agree. This is so great, and I got to quote her a little bit as I was doing the financial revision. So that was economists on state formation, and this sort of spills over to my current project on. I'm thinking about risk mitigation, but in the case of climate risk mitigation in the United States, also starting that story from the 1970s, and I'm really interested in the impact of climate change economists as the experts. So there's definitely, that was an important part of my story. Another part of my story was, like, again, thinking of the state as a protective state and what its transformation entailed, not only in terms of retreat, but also in terms of, being more micro-focused, more information-based, and so on and so forth. And then the last chapter, again, in search of protection, I call it, because I talk about the populist rise, because I want to bring it to questions of changing states' sort of commitment to protection in times of major structural economic change, right? And so, I mean, I link it to populism, and this is a really interesting part of the story for me, because this is where I think there's a huge difference between, say, sort of how liberalism and industrial capitalism, sort of 19th century liberalism, industrial capitalism, state response, what that meant for sort of democratic futures versus how neoliberal states' response to financialization and risk meant for sort of for the crisis of democracy, are really fundamental different things, and that's where I leave the book, in a dark place, talking about populism as a result of disembedded financialization.
Well, and I think with my recent book, Hedged Out, it focuses more on work organizations themselves. But I did notice some overlaps with your books in terms of that within the hedge fund industry, they don't fall neatly on these political divides, bipartisan divides. Their interests are intertwined and kind of challenge those. And then during my field observations at big industry events in particular, there were, Washington, D.C. lobbyists were often there. It was clear these connections with D.C. And in my fieldwork, I encountered, 3 people who participated in the Trump administration. That was partly because of when my fieldwork was. Hedge funds also have ties to Democratic administrations as well. And I think this really points to the fact that we aren't always able to observe those connections. They aren't always in the public eye because they're happening in these closed events that are very hard to access. These are all events with lots of security, and are spaces that they're not really openly sharing with the public. And this is something Ken and I really emphasize in our book, that is these dynamics that shaped the regulatory response to the crisis, that really led to a lack of addressing of the fact that finance and its interests create and exacerbate inequality in so many ways. And it's because of these intertwined interests between finance and the state that it doesn't address, that the regulatory response doesn't take head on the kind of broader implications beyond, the risk of the big firms like you talked about. But especially these smaller shadow banks, incur less regulation with the idea that their investors are sophisticated, but we know they have broader implications for the stability of markets and for inequality more broadly, that are really that challenge and kind of undermine some of the other purposes of the state. So I wanted to thank you both so much for these answers. And I wanted to kind of open up for a moment. If I have many more questions I can ask, but I wanted to open it up to the audience to hear what you all, what questions you might have or responses to this discussion. And welcome you all, if either to add questions to the chat, or if you want to join in. This is a great moment to do so.
I have a question for Megan, but I could wait. I was going to say one thing. Oh, I'm so sorry. There's actually a question, but could I do this and then we move on? Because I think one thing, like when you study the state, in a way that Kim and I do. Sometimes it's really sort of easy to miss the intersectional thinking about the outcomes of policies. Our race, gender, and class intersects, right? So for instance, when I talk about indebtedness and what happened, and talk about like sort of the predatory loans, sure, there are references in my book to how these things hurt Black and brown families more so than others, and so on and so forth. But one of the, I think, things that you do, Megan, is also bring those race, gender, class dynamics, right, in ethnographic work. Do you want to say a few things to us about like how things look from your end?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I'll be brief because I also want to hear what Hector has to ask as well. But when the focus of my book is really about how when we think about gender, race, and social classes, systems of inequality, they shape how these industries are structured, especially like I mentioned before, shadow banking within finance and especially hedge funds that enable them, the fact that they are so skewed in terms of who controls them. For example, in hedge funds, 97% of assets are managed by firms run entirely by white men. And we're talking about 4 trillion in assets. And what I argue is that is the fact that they can keep people out, that they can hedge them out while allowing others in, is part of what enables them to have this kind of sense of entitlement and lack of accountability for what they do in financial markets, and how they, use onshore, offshore structures to their advantage. They evade taxes. It's all part of these kind of same systems that breed entitlement and advantage and enables them to exert that kind of power with little incursion and oversight. And I do want to. So Hector, you had a question. I'll let you jump in, please.
Yeah, thank you. Congratulations on your books. I'm really hoping to read them. My question is to Basak. I'm working also with Polanyi and the dialectic of embedment and disembedment, and I was wondering, like, what do you think is the main contribution of your book to that theorization from the Polanyian perspective on financialization? You mentioned at some point Slobodia, and I think he's really critical about the introduction of the Polanyian framework to understand the current trends of neoliberalism, because this dialectic between embedding and disembedding not necessarily give us a chance to see what's going on and how markets actually are built and created through our institutions. So I think you stress a lot that point in your presentation. So I was wondering, what do you think is your main contribution to that theorization?
Right after the crisis, popularity of Polanyi has increased. Like there was a turn to Polanyi in economic sociology and political economy. And then there was a little backlash. Like it almost like that all there was like, is it another Polanyian take? Or what does that mean? And people read Polanyi differently. And I think we have to be careful in terms of what it means to bring these scholars who wrote about very different circumstances in the 19th century to the contemporary period, right? So like, for instance, the way I tackle Polanyi is not like when Nancy Fraser says, oh, we're just observing the same thing that Polanyi talked about. No, we are not, because the markets that we are dealing with are not the same markets. The idea of self-regulation is completely different. It has a different meaning. The economists of today, financial economists who were pushing for various policies in the 90s, are not the 18th, 19th century economists. So we have to think carefully about what it means to bring a scholar like Polanyi to the present era. And I try to be mindful of that in the book. I think for people, another thing that is just like sort of this embedding, disembedding. Everything was great in the post-war era, and all of a sudden neoliberalism came and it was disembedded. They find these juxtapositions simplistic, and they are right about it. As Kim said, things are not linear, right? So, I mean, it really depends. Sometimes you look at the same picture and you tell a story of discontinuity and it's there. And sometimes you look at the same picture and then you tell a story of continuity. It is there also. So we have to be careful about, when I gave a talk last week at Sciences Po, and my discussant also pushed me on this point. but like who were the ruling, Polanyi was very cool, who were the ruling elites? And sort of asked me questions with a Marxian bent. And then I asked, and then this is Matthias Thiemann, who also, of course, has written a lot about these things. I was like, what do you think was, for this era, the repeal of the Spinelman law? Like, because for Polanyi, that's where it starts, right? So if, for instance, we were to point to a particular legislation, like the repeal of, what was it? We have to think about it. And what Kim is trying to do is to think about it in 3 different contexts, right? For instance, so I think we shouldn't throw Polanyi out. I'm a big Polanyi fan. I will not, I will die on this hill, but I also understand why people are critical with certain adaptations of Polanyi. Does that make sense? Thank you. Thank you that's a great question.
Thank you.
Nina, I'll hand it over to you. I see your hand up.
Thank you so much. This was so exciting that, I was wide awake right away at 7 a.m., which is, talking about finance and things that some people might fall asleep at. But congratulations. I wondered, with your sort of sociological imagination, political economy take, is there a piece of research that you encountered that really was like, oh, that is different from what I expected? It's a real process of discovery, right? Something really new that perhaps you handled or you want to handle in the future. So it's kind of a 2-part question. If there's something that stays in your mind about your research that you really want to say one more time about what you've discovered, and then where you're going next after that. Whichever you want to take, but now just take one because I see there are more questions.
Basak, your book came out sooner, so you should go.
I'm still thinking, you go first.
Okay. What an excellent question. So I think the pattern that surprised me most when I was working on this project is that I couldn't believe that the US was the international laggard in every aspect of financial deregulation that I considered. So when we think about the deregulation of interest rate ceilings on deposits, right? If we think about lifting restrictions on thrifts, right? Like what SNLs are allowed to do. Glass-Steagall, the repeal of Glass-Steagall, right? Branching restrictions, lifting those in 1994. It's like every single time the US is bringing up the, among developed countries, the rear of getting rid of these very important regulatory restrictions. That doesn't change the fact that financial deregulation in the US and elsewhere was the launching point towards financialization in the way that it has been discussed by countless other sociologists. But I just couldn't believe it until I had done enough research to see that this is what's going on. And so I think, to me, something I would like to continue exploring and that I found personally interesting is thinking through how this does and doesn't change the current narrative that we're telling about financial deregulation and its relationship to financialization. So I think I want to be clear that the existing story is still the story, right? That financial deregulation absolutely did have these effects on financial markets, and we can't go back, right? The cat is out of the bag, and this historical shift had incredibly important implications for the development of financial markets in the US and elsewhere. But it is thinking through what it means that the US, the country where I think most of us would agree that financialization has reached its ultimate expression, was late to the party in the regulatory changes that were so crucial to how financialization has unfolded. And so to me, I think that part of the current narrative about the relationship between financial deregulation and financialization is telling a story about how, against all odds, the advocates of deregulation were able to achieve their aims. And that's an important story. But I think an equally important part of the story is, well, why was the resistance so comparatively pronounced in the US in the first place? And how did we go from tight regulation to absolute, anarchy? Even with these historical steps. And so I think, Basak, that's something I also really love about your book, and a point that I think our work really shares, which is moving beyond financial deregulation is absolutely part of the story, but like regulatory drift, right? These other features of the American regulatory environment well beyond financial deregulation and the hidden but important role that this policy regime has had in fanning the flames in a way that we haven't seen quite to the same extent in other countries. But thank you. What a great question.
It's a really good question. I will start from where Kim stopped in terms of like this as a regulation of deregulation. I mean, there's one in particular, that repeal of Glass-Steagall. Like before I started this research, I thought, oh, it's all about because, and it's really, I mean, aside from deregulation being only a part of the story, the repeal of Glass-Steagall to me at the end it wasn't really that much of the big deal. And this is what policymakers also, by the time it's repealed, I mean, by de facto, things had changed so much that they were like, this is all, at this point, we are just putting our signatures. So that's one thing. I think there were so many interesting surprises to writing different chapters. The part about economists and regulation. So when I was reading these 1970s regulatory capture economists, and in my mind, they are libertarians, they don't like the state. But I'm figuring out that, and this is a surprise to me, and maybe it's not a surprise to many of you, but radical left historians in the 1960s had been hitting the sort of state and regulation from a left angle in similar ways. And seeing those affinities was interesting. I think trying to figure out financial economists and regulatory change link was really challenging for me. It was there, but I also found it difficult to show that it was there. And I think somebody will do a better job at some point in the future. Again, thinking about finance, we think of it as like this sort of finance as a block, right? In a sort of homogeneous thing. But then figuring out, no, banks and non-bank financial institutions are totally different animals with different interests, lobbying in different ways for different things. Within banks, small banks and large banks are totally different. Finding out how powerful small banks were in the aftermath of the crisis and you know, helped Frank and Dodd to be able to do those things. And I'm figuring out that actually in the aftermath of the Great Depression, small banks had really punched above their weight as well. So sort of the power of unexpected small actors sometimes. There were all these interesting things. And in terms of like an intellectual awakening, again, I'm going to refer to Democracy Against Domination. I really liked the book because, it was the first time that I thought, okay, I really have to think about these questions in terms of what it means like to think about these regulatory policy in terms of technocracy and democracy and populism. And I'm not saying I agree with everything the book says. I'm critical with certain aspects of it, but it pushed me to a nice stream of thought, and I really, really like that.
I think we had one more question and hand raised from Jen. Do you want to take the last question?
Yeah, I lowered my hand because we're nearing the end of the session. I can take it offline if the timing it's not great.
Just go ahead.
Minutes. Okay, I have a quick question for Kim. So we worked on this together to some capacity. I'm really excited it's out. Congratulations. I want to kind of just borrow one of the comments that Basak said about other institutions and their role in deregulation. We can't just see it as a deliberate project from the government, and there are a lot of actors that push these deregulation efforts. I'm curious, I think in your research, to what capacity do you see the differences among private institutions like commercial banks and all the other financial institutions in all three countries that are different, and how these differences among the institutions themselves drive the divergent direction of the deregulation, re-regulation efforts in all three countries?
Great, thanks, Zen. Yes, Zen, I got to give a shout out to an excellent research assistant here who read a lot of Canadian legislative regulatory transcripts. So thank you for this, and thank you for this question. I think a surprise to me in looking, so in each case, I think the default is that policy change happened because a powerful industry wanted it, right? So at each episode of regulatory reform, I'm attentive to what what did the banks look like? How are they organized and what did they want? And then beyond the banks, like to Basak's point about the non-bank financial institutions, their power, like what did they want? And I think like looking at the big picture, what I was surprised by was sometimes patterns aligned with what was expected, where, you know, savings and loans institutions are relatively powerful in the US. And so they were more likely to get what they wanted than, you know, similar types of institutions making similar arguments in Canada. But I think what was an important twist on the story for me were two things, which was similar interest groups across different countries. So like non-bank savings institutions, commercial banks, home builders, like in other interest groups, making different types of arguments to government regulators. And so it would be the same groups, presumably with similar interests, but arguing their cases in different ways and in ways that aligned with like broader understandings of, you know, what leads to order and prosperity in the economy. And then cases where banks didn't get their way, which happened in all three countries. But where they were more likely to get their way were often the spots where the interests of regulators from their worldview, right, what they wanted to do, aligned with the interests of the regulated industry. And so it's not saying that regulatory capture isn't still a real and pervasive problem, because it absolutely is. We have abundant evidence on this. But in thinking about regulatory capture as the primary driver of differences across countries, I feel like I would add to this, it's a two-way street. Like what the power the industry is exerting over regulators has been well studied, but we have looked less at the relative receptiveness of regulators to arguments from the powerful industry, and this receptiveness and interpretation of the arguments matter just as much types of policies that end up getting adopted.
Well, I want to thank you so much. And I just want to close by thanking everyone in the audience for today and for questions. And I also wanted to plug that at the upcoming annual meeting, there's some great forum events, so you can check those out. And then most of all, I want to thank our authors. And just I want to mention how much I learned from these books. They are beautifully written and meticulously researched, and they really inform your understanding of how we with respect to regulation. And so thank you so much. Big congrats for both of your books, and thank you all.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you for coming. Yeah.